In the early years of the air war over Europe, German fighter pilots viewed American aircraft with a mix of curiosity and contempt. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 were agile, fast, and battle-tested over France, Britain, and Russia. They were designed for quick climbs and tight turns, precision instruments for skilled pilots. When reports emerged in late 1942 that the Americans had begun flying a new heavy fighter in England, German intelligence officers were puzzled. The aircraft, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, looked enormous compared to anything else in the sky. It was nearly twice the weight of a Bf-109, with a massive radial engine and wings as broad as a bomber's. To many Luftwaffe pilots, the idea of such a machine competing with their sleek fighters seemed absurd. In its early missions, the P-47 did little to change their opinions. The Thunderbolt's climb rate was poor, its acceleration sluggish, and its handling awkward at low altitude. German pilots described it as a flying barn door. During intercepts against American bomber formations in 1943, the Luftwaffe often ignored P-47s entirely, focusing instead on shooting down the B-17s and B-24s they were meant to escort. In radio chatter recorded by Allied intelligence, German pilots mocked the Americans for sending such a clumsy monster to war. But what the Luftwaffe didn't yet realize was that the Thunderbolt had been engineered around an entirely different design philosophy. Where German fighters were built for agility and lightness, the P-47 was built for survival. Its core was a 2,000 horsepower Pratt& Whitney R2800 double Wasp, the same engine used in some Navy aircraft, and it was surrounded by an armored bathtub that protected the pilot from nearly every direction. The air-cooled radial engine could take multiple hits without losing power, and the fuel system included self-sealing tanks that automatically closed when punctured. Beneath the skin of the P-47 lay layer upon layer of redundancy: double hydraulic lines, multiple control cables, and heavy structural spars that could absorb punishment no other Allied fighter could endure. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England with the 4th Fighter Group in early 1943. The American pilots who received them were skeptical at first. They had trained in nimble P-40s in Spitfires, and the P-47 felt sluggish in comparison. But as they began to understand the aircraft's strengths, its high-altitude performance, its diving speed, and its durability, attitudes changed. The Thunderbolt could reach altitudes above 30,000 feet, where Luftwaffe aircraft began to struggle for power. Once in a dive, the P-47's immense weight became an advantage. It could reach speeds over 500 miles per hour, faster than almost anything else in the air. It was in these high-speed dives that the P-47 first earned respect from friend and foe alike. German pilots, accustomed to dominating aerial engagements through superior agility, suddenly found that their 20mm cannons and 7.92mm machine guns did little against the American fighter's thick armor. Shells that would have torn apart a Spitfire or a Mustang merely left dents or holes in the Thunderbolt's skin. When a P-47 returned to base peppered with hits, but fully operational, ground crews and intelligence officers began to grasp what the engineers at Republic had achieved. Early combat reports from the 56th Fighter Group documented engagements where Thunderbolts absorbed staggering damage and still brought their pilots home. One aircraft returned with an entire cylinder shot off its engine. Another landed safely after its rudder was shredded and one elevator severed. In multiple cases, pilots reported oil pressure loss and power failure at altitude, only for the engine to restart once the aircraft leveled off. Evidence of the radial's resilience. The Germans began to take notice. By mid-1943, Luftwaffe field commanders were warning pilots not to underestimate the Thunderbolt. Its performance in vertical dives allowed it to disengage almost at will, and its durability meant that conventional head-on attacks were risky. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns delivered a devastating weight of fire that could tear apart any German aircraft in seconds. What had begun as a target of ridicule was becoming a formidable opponent. The transformation from flying barn door to feared combat aircraft was not a matter of perception alone. It reflected the brutal logic of attrition that defined the air war over Europe. While the Luftwaffe sought superiority through pilot skill and precision tactics, the Allies sought endurance, machines and men that could survive the grinding, endless battle of the skies. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its heavy armor and indestructible engine, became the embodiment of that philosophy. By the summer of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become the mainstay of the U.S. 8th Air Force's fighter operations in Europe. Its primary mission was to escort B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into German-occupied territory, a task that tested the limits of both aircraft and pilot endurance. The Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader units, flying Bf-109G and FW-190A variants, were well organized and experienced. German pilots had honed interception tactics designed to destroy bomber formations with minimal exposure to escort fighters. But the arrival of the P-47 began to disrupt those tactics. In high-altitude engagements above 25,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged engine gave it an unexpected advantage. The massive R-2800 engine maintained power where most German fighters began to lose thrust. Luftwaffe pilots, accustomed to out-climbing and out-accelerating enemy aircraft, found that the P-47 could stay with them in vertical maneuvers. And when it couldn't, when German fighters tried to dive away, the Thunderbolt's sheer weight and aerodynamic design allowed it to follow at astonishing speed. This was the beginning of what American pilots called boom and zoom tactics. The P-47 would dive from altitude, attack at over 400 miles per hour, and climb away before the enemy could respond. In this regime, maneuverability mattered less than energy retention and structural strength. The Luftwaffe began to experience unexpected losses as Thunderbolts struck from above and escaped before counterattack. German radio intercepts recorded pilots complaining that the heavy American fighter cannot be caught once it dives. Still, German commanders reassured their men that the Thunderbolt was too heavy to survive sustained combat. That belief was shattered during a series of engagements in late 1943. One occurred on September 6th, during the raid on Stuttgart. P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group encountered a swarm of Bf-109s attacking the bomber stream. In the ensuing melee, several Thunderbolts were hit, some repeatedly, by cannon shells and machine gun bursts, yet nearly all made it home. One aircraft returned with over 100 bullet holes, its pilot uninjured. Another was struck in the engine and lost oil pressure, but flew more than 150 miles back to England. German reports from the same mission tell a different story. Pilots noted frustration that the heavy American fighter does not fall even when struck in the engine. Luftwaffe intelligence officers at the time assumed the Thunderbolt's engines were protected by armor plating, but in reality it was the air-cooled radial design that made the difference. Unlike inline engines, such as the liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz B605 used in the Bf-109, the radial engine had no vulnerable coolant system. Even with cylinders damaged or leaking oil, it could continue running long enough for the pilot to reach safety. This mechanical resilience was a defining feature of the P-47's combat identity. The Republic engineers, led by Alexander Kartveli, had deliberately designed the aircraft to absorb punishment. Every vital system was backed up. The cockpit was enclosed by armor plate, the fuel tanks were self-sealing, and the electrical wiring was routed through redundant channels. When ground crews examined returning aircraft, they found evidence that these design features were saving lives daily. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, began to shift tactics. Pilots were instructed to avoid head-on or prolonged attacks against Thunderbolts and instead target bombers wherever possible. But by late 1943, this was easier said than done. The U.S. 8th Air Force was deploying P-47s in greater numbers and extending their range through the use of drop tanks. By the winter of 1943-44, Thunderbolts were accompanying bombers as far as the German border, and later even deeper into the Reich. As the scope of escort operations grew, so too did the Thunderbolt's reputation. It was no longer the clumsy brute that German pilots mocked. It had become a symbol of American industrial might, a flying fortress in its own right, designed to endure and strike back. The Luftwaffe's attempts to maintain air superiority were becoming increasingly desperate, and the P-47 was one of the reasons why. By early 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer a curiosity to the Luftwaffe. It was a menace. German pilots, once confident that their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs could dominate any Allied fighter, began to adapt their tactics specifically to counter the Jug. Yet for every adjustment, the Thunderbolt's design seemed to negate the advantage. German intelligence assessments from January 1944 described the aircraft as exceptionally fast in dive and durable to damage. Reconnaissance photos of crashed Thunderbolts astonished analysts. The aircraft's fuselage was so heavily built that even wrecked examples showed minimal deformation compared to other fighters. The Republic engineers had effectively constructed a semi-monocoque tank with wings. The German aircrew's disbelief grew as engagement reports accumulated. Pilots reported firing long bursts from 20mm G151 cannons at Thunderbolts, only to watch the enemy continue flying. On multiple occasions, Thunderbolts returned to base with sections of their tail or control surfaces shredded, yet remained controllable. This resilience was not luck. It was the deliberate result of engineering decisions that emphasized structural integrity over weight savings. The Thunderbolt's armor layout was methodical. The pilot sat behind a thick steel plate with additional armor panels beneath and behind the seat. The front of the cockpit was shielded by a bullet-resistant windshield capable of withstanding direct hits from rifle-caliber rounds. The fuel tanks located in the fuselage belly were lined with self-sealing rubber. When punctured, the material swelled to close small holes, reducing fire risk dramatically. At first, Luftwaffe command refused to believe these reports. To them, the idea that an American fighter could survive cannon fire contradicted years of experience. German aircraft relied on speed and agility for protection, not armor. In the doctrinal thinking of the Luftwaffe, armor was for tanks, not for the sky. But as attrition mounted, German engineers were ordered to analyze captured wreckage. What they found confirmed what their pilots had already witnessed in combat. Thunderbolt wrecks recovered in France, and the Low Countries revealed armor thicknesses up to 8mm around the cockpit, more than double that of most German fighters. Even the oil cooler and engine cowling contained protective plating designed to deflect shrapnel. The Luftwaffe's technical office concluded that the P-47 could withstand roughly twice as much damage as a Bf-109 before becoming uncontrollable. Field units responded with desperation. The Focke-Wulf FWW-190A-8 received the Sturmbach modification, extra armor plating, and 30mm cannons in an attempt to counter heavy American aircraft, including the P-47. But the added weight crippled performance, making these variants easy prey for Thunderbolts in a dogfight. Meanwhile, American pilots were exploiting the aircraft's survivability in combat. They learned to stay in the fight longer, confident that their machines could take punishment and return. Pilots described attacks where flak ripped through the wings or cannon shells exploded near the engine. Yet the Thunderbolt kept flying. Ground crews patched hundreds of holes with aluminum sheets and sent the aircraft back into the air the next morning. The Thunderbolt's reputation spread rapidly across the Luftwaffe. The same pilots who once laughed at its bulk now approached with caution. They began calling it the Fliegender Panzer, the flying tank. Even when outnumbered, a formation of Thunderbolts could absorb damage that would destroy a squadron of lighter fighters. In the broader picture of the air war, this shift marked a turning point. The Luftwaffe's strategy depended on inflicting heavy losses on Allied bombers and escorts to slow the momentum of the Allied advance. But when its pilots discovered that their guns could no longer guarantee kills, morale began to crack. The Thunderbolt's strength was not only in its metal, but in the psychological impact it had on its enemies. As 1944 progressed, the Thunderbolt's reputation for indestructibility was solidified by combat data. The U.S. Army Air Forces meticulously tracked loss and damage reports. They discovered that, statistically, the P-47 had the lowest loss rate of any Allied single-engine fighter operating over Europe. In missions involving deep penetration raids, where flak and enemy interceptors claimed dozens of bombers, Thunderbolts consistently returned home when other fighters did not. One of the clearest demonstrations came during the massive raids over Germany in February and March 1944, part of the Allied campaign known as Big Week. Hundreds of Thunderbolts escorted bomber formations targeting aircraft factories and industrial centers. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into defense, launching hundreds of interceptors in coordinated attacks. BF-109Gs and FW-190Ws is dove through the bomber streams, raking American aircraft with 20mm and 30mm cannon fire. The results shocked German commanders. Of the dozens of Thunderbolts hit, many returned to England despite severe damage. Gun camera footage from the day showed aircraft trailing smoke, with entire control surfaces missing, yet staying airborne. Some even completed the mission and continued escort duty before heading back. For every Thunderbolt that went down, several German fighters were destroyed in return, a ratio that alarmed the Luftwaffe's high command. Engineers on both sides began analyzing why the P-47 could endure what would kill other planes. The answer was a combination of brute force design and engineering foresight. Republic's use of the R-2800 double WASP engine, a two-row, 18-cylinder radial powerhouse, made the aircraft's nose nearly impervious to small-caliber fire. The engine's compact shape, absence of coolant lines, and redundant magnetos meant it could take multiple hits and still deliver power. In tests, even after losing one or two cylinders, the engine could maintain over 60% thrust output. Moreover, the aircraft's size and mass gave it tremendous momentum and kinetic stability. In combat, this meant that when a Thunderbolt was hit, the sudden loss of airflow or aileron function didn't immediately send it spiraling out of control. Its mass absorbed shocks that would tear apart lighter planes. A pilot could nurse it home even with asymmetric control, something practically impossible in a Bf-109. German field reports, especially from Jagdgeschwader 26 and 54, started to reflect this grim reality. One after-action debrief recorded a pilot claiming he had fired 200 rounds of 20mm ammunition into a Thunderbolt's rear fuselage, seeing armor flash. Yet the aircraft climbed away, streaming fuel but still flying. Another noted that even when P-47s were down, they often crashed intact, evidence of their extraordinary structural integrity. This physical resilience translated directly into strategic consequences. Allied fighter groups could sustain prolonged engagements without crippling losses, maintaining pressure on Luftwaffe defenses day after day. The Thunderbolt's ability to take punishment and return meant its pilots gained more experience over time, a critical factor as the Luftwaffe's veteran corps dwindled. By mid-1944, German units facing Thunderbolts began changing their approach. Instead of engaging head-on or from behind, pilots were ordered to attack from steep vertical dives, where the Jug's heavy weight limited its immediate evasive ability. Yet even this tactic often failed, as Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive away, using their superior dive speed to escape. In dives, the P-47 could exceed 500 miles per hour without structural failure, a figure few German aircraft could safely match. This advantage proved crucial in the skies over occupied France during the summer of 1944. As the Allies prepared for the Normandy invasion, Thunderbolts operated in vast numbers, striking railways, convoys, and airfields. When Luftwaffe fighters attempted interception, they discovered that the same armor that once made the Jug a joke now made it nearly impossible to destroy. The aircraft could shrug off ground fire, sustain flak hits, and still return to base. In the words of one captured German officer, the Thunderbolt was not a fighter, it was a machine of iron. You could shoot at it, but it would not die. The transformation of the P-47 Thunderbolt from an underestimated brute into a feared adversary mirrored the evolution of the air war itself. In 1942 and early 1943, the Luftwaffe had dictated the terms of aerial combat. By mid-1944, it was forced into a defensive posture, reacting to an Allied air force that grew larger, better coordinated, and more technologically advanced with every month. The Thunderbolt became a centerpiece of this shift, not because it was elegant, but because it could survive anything thrown at it and keep flying. Combat over France and the Low Countries provided constant evidence of this. When the Allies began the pre-invasion bombing campaign, P-47 units like the 78th, 56th, and 362nd Fighter Groups were tasked with strafing rail lines, locomotives, and troop convoys. These low-altitude missions exposed them to anti-aircraft fire that would have shredded most aircraft. The Thunderbolts came back peppered with holes but still in one piece, Ground crews logged cases of aircraft returning with parts of control surfaces missing, main gear damaged, or entire panels torn away by shrapnel, and yet the aircraft remained flyable. The Luftwaffe's frontline pilots were well aware of the Thunderbolt's durability. Many considered it a frustrating opponent. Their 20-millimeter cannons, devastating against Spitfires or Mustangs, had limited effect on the Jug's armor and massive radial engine. Only a direct hit from a 30-millimeter Mk-108 shell could guarantee a kill, and few German fighters carried enough ammunition to sustain long bursts. German intelligence officers studying crash reports came to the same conclusion. In one 1944 analysis, engineers compared recovered Thunderbolt wrecks with the Bf-109G6. They found that the Republic fighter's aluminum skin was nearly twice as thick in key structural areas, and that its internal framing was reinforced by additional spars. This gave it incredible rigidity, allowing pilots to pull extreme G loads without risking structural failure. When combined with its heavy armor around the cockpit and engine, the result was a fighter that could take damage equivalent to a medium bomber. On the Allied side, the Thunderbolt's toughness became a morale symbol. Pilots trusted the aircraft with their lives, often pushing it to limits that would terrify ground engineers. Accounts circulated of P-47s landing with landing gear shot away, belly sliding across runways, others with one wing half destroyed making perfect approaches. The myth of the indestructible Jug spread not as propaganda, but as shared experience. One famous case occurred on June 12, 1944, when a P-47 from the 56th Fighter Group was struck by flak over Normandy. The shell exploded beneath the fuselage, destroying part of the tailplane and rupturing the fuel tank. The pilot, losing control, managed to regain partial trim and flew 90 miles back to England. When the aircraft was examined, engineers found more than 200 shrapnel holes, a missing elevator, and a shattered oil cooler. The engine had run dry minutes before landing, yet it had not caught fire. By this stage of the war, the Thunderbolt was evolving. The new P-47D-25 introduced a bubble canopy for improved visibility, additional armor, and the ability to carry larger drop tanks. With range extended beyond 1,000 miles, Thunderbolts could escort bombers all the way into Germany and return. This erased the Luftwaffe's last tactical advantage, the ability to attack deep penetration raids unopposed once escort fighters turned back. German pilots who once mocked the Jug's bulk now found themselves fighting it at every altitude, from 30,000 feet down to treetop level. They discovered that the same aircraft which could shrug off cannon fire in the stratosphere could also devastate convoys on the ground with 8.50 caliber machine guns. When combined with rockets and bombs, the Thunderbolt became one of the most versatile attack platforms of the war. The Luftwaffe's dwindling fuel supplies and shrinking pilot pool made each encounter costlier. The P-47's survivability meant Allied pilots lived to fight again, gaining experience with every mission, while German replacements entered combat with minimal training. The outcome of this imbalance was inevitable. By the late summer of 1944, Luftwaffe veterans were openly calling the Thunderbolt der Panzerjäger, the tank killer. It could dive through flak, destroy armored columns, and climb out with its armor scorched but intact. What had begun as a heavy, awkward escort fighter was now a weapon of attrition, one that Germany could no longer counter effectively. The summer and autumn of 1944 marked the high point of the Thunderbolt's dominance in the European theater. With Allied forces pushing through France after the Normandy landings, the Luftwaffe's once formidable defense of the Reich was collapsing. Fuel shortages, exhausted pilots, and relentless Allied bombing campaigns left German squadrons with only fragments of their former strength. Yet even in this diminished state, when German fighters did rise to meet the invaders, they found themselves facing an opponent that seemed impervious to destruction. In ground attack operations, the Thunderbolt's armor and radial engine gave it an unmatched ability to operate at low altitude under heavy fire. Pilots from the 362nd and 365th Fighter Groups, nicknamed Hell Hawks, routinely attacked German columns, rail lines, and armored vehicles. Their combat reports read like technical case studies in survivability. Aircraft hit by flak or small arms fire often completed multiple strafing runs before returning to base. One pilot described seeing entire sheets of tracer rounds bounce off the wings. Another wrote simply, "This plane takes punishment like a battleship." The Luftwaffe, reduced to sporadic resistance, tried to adapt. FW-190F and G variants equipped for ground attack were redeployed in defensive roles, using their 20mm and 30mm cannons against Allied fighter bombers. But against the P-47, these efforts achieved little. Even direct cannon strikes frequently failed to destroy the Thunderbolt outright. German flak crews also found it frustratingly durable. The 20mm flak Vierling could bring down a Spitfire or Mustang with a few hits, but Thunderbolts often absorbed multiple bursts before losing control. In one notable incident near the town of Mortain in August 1944, a P-47 flown by Lieutenant Robert Johnson was struck repeatedly by both 20mm cannon fire and small arms rounds during a low-level attack. The aircraft's canopy was shattered, control cables damaged, and a tire blown out. Johnson flew the crippled fighter 80 miles back to his base, landing safely on one wheel and the belly tank. When inspected, the airframe contained 21 visible cannon holes and hundreds of smaller impacts. The report concluded simply, "Pilot unharmed. Aircraft repairable." These incidents transformed the Thunderbolt into a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. German ground troops who had once taken comfort in the vulnerability of Allied aircraft now viewed the P-47 with dread. Its engine roar, amplified by the propeller's immense diameter, became synonymous with sudden devastation. Soldiers described it as the hammer from the sky. Strategically, the Thunderbolt's toughness enabled a new kind of warfare. The Allies began to rely heavily on fighter-bomber sweeps, where groups of P-47s roamed far beyond the front lines, hunting targets of opportunity. Each sortie inflicted losses not just on German logistics, but on morale. The Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee air defense, and the Army could no longer move safely by day. At the same time, German intelligence continued to study down Thunderbolts, hoping to identify weaknesses. They discovered that while the aircraft's armor was effective, its large size and weight made it difficult to repair in the field. A direct hit to the wing spars or tail section could still render it unflyable. But such hits were rare. The probability of destroying a P-47 outright in one pass was less than 10%. An intolerable statistic for pilots who might never get a second chance. The Thunderbolt's survivability had another consequence. It gave the Allies the luxury of consistency. Unlike German squadrons, whose experienced pilots were constantly lost and replaced, American groups maintained cohesive units over long campaigns. Crews learned each other's habits, refined tactics, and shared knowledge. The aircraft's ability to bring its pilots home meant that hard-earned lessons were preserved rather than buried. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's situation was dire. Every new American raid brought more Thunderbolts, more Mustangs, and fewer German aircraft returning. In the skies over Aachen, Cologne, and the Ardennes, the P-47's presence symbolized Allied superiority. It was not elegant, and it was not fast compared to the latest German jets, but it was unstoppable. To the men who faced it, the Thunderbolt was no longer a flying barn door. It was an indestructible machine, a weapon that embodied the relentless, industrial power of the United States. By the final months of 1944, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had become one of the most feared sights in the European sky. The Luftwaffe, once the most advanced air force in the world, was now fighting for survival against a relentless tide of Allied aircraft that seemed to grow stronger as the war dragged on. While the P-51 Mustang eventually took over the deep escort role, the P-47's reign as a low-level attacker and close support platform was reaching its brutal peak. Its heavy armor and durability allowed it to fight in environments that would have destroyed lighter aircraft, and this capability reshaped the final phase of the air war. When the Allies advanced into the Ardennes during the winter of 1944-45, the Thunderbolt became indispensable. The Battle of the Bulge, launched by Germany in December 1944, was an attempt to split the Allied front and recapture the initiative. Poor weather initially grounded most Allied aircraft, giving German armor a temporary advantage. But once the skies cleared, the Thunderbolts descended in force. Flying multiple sorties each day, they attacked roads, bridges, and armored columns, turning German advances into burning wrecks. Reports from the field described how P-47s routinely flew through curtains of flak to deliver rocket and bomb attacks. Their armor, thick skin, and robust control systems allowed them to endure hits that would have downed other fighters instantly. After-action logs recorded Thunderbolts returning to base with engines damaged, flaps destroyed, or entire sections of tail assembly missing. One aircraft, hit by a direct 88mm shell near Bastogne, limped back to Allied lines with half of its rudder gone. The pilot survived. German soldiers on the ground learned to fear the distinct sound of the Thunderbolt's radial engine. Its approach was deeper and heavier than the whine of a Mustang or Spitfire. To them, it was the sound of inevitability, the noise that preceded another convoy destroyed, another tank disabled. Captured Wehrmacht diaries frequently mention the P-47 terror, with one soldier writing, "We shoot until the barrels glow red, but it does not fall. It just keeps coming." At the same time, the Thunderbolt's durability gave its pilots unmatched confidence. They flew lower, pressed attacks longer, and took risks that would have been suicidal in lighter aircraft. The radial engine, protected by armor and devoid of fragile coolant systems, shrugged off small-caliber fire. Even when oil leaks or fuel punctures occurred, self-sealing tanks and redundant systems bought pilots precious minutes, often enough to reach friendly territory. Allied command recognized the psychological and tactical importance of this resilience. The P-47's survival rate made it the ideal platform for the high-risk missions required in the final push into Germany. Entire squadrons were assigned to fighter-bomber sweeps, operating independently to cut supply lines and destroy infrastructure. The results were devastating. Rail transport in Western Germany all but collapsed, and German reinforcements struggled to reach the front. Luftwaffe pilots who encountered Thunderbolts during these months found themselves in an impossible situation. Their aircraft, lighter, underpowered, and increasingly flown by inexperienced men, were no match for the heavily armed jugs. Even when German fighters scored hits, they often failed to bring down their targets. As one FW-190 pilot recalled after the war, it was like shooting at a steel wall. You would see sparks, flashes, but it kept flying, and then it turned and came for you. By 1945, this resilience had become legend. P-47 pilots shared stories of aircraft returning with entire wings shredded or engines missing cylinders, yet still flying true. Each of these tales reinforced the aircraft's image not as a symbol of speed or agility, but of endurance, the airborne reflection of an industrial war machine that refused to break. In those last bitter months, as Germany's fuel reserves dwindled and its pilots fought with diminishing hope, the Thunderbolt's invulnerability represented more than just American engineering. It symbolized inevitability, the unstoppable momentum of a war that had turned decisively against the Reich. As 1945 began, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Its airfields were under constant attack, its fuel depots destroyed, and its training schools reduced to emergency programs, turning out barely qualified pilots. Against this collapsing force, the P-47 Thunderbolt continued its relentless campaign. It was no longer just an escort fighter. It had become an instrument of destruction across the entire European front. Its heavy armor, massive payload, and near-indestructible engine made it the perfect weapon for the final phase of the war. In January 1945, Thunderbolts operated almost exclusively in the fighter-bomber role, hunting German armor, convoys, and retreating troops. Missions launched from forward airfields in Belgium and France saw waves of P-47s sweeping into the Rhineland. They attacked at treetop level, their 8.50 caliber guns shredding vehicles and infantry alike. Rockets and 500-pound bombs added a new layer of devastation, giving each aircraft the striking power of a small bomber. Under normal conditions, such low-level operations would have been suicidal. Anti-aircraft guns ringed every major road and bridge, and even small towns had machine gun nests waiting to fire on any passing plane. Yet the Thunderbolt endured. Combat reports from February 1945 listed dozens of aircraft returning with significant battle damage. Holes through the fuselage, severed control lines, shattered canopies. but pilots alive. Out of hundreds of sorties, losses remained remarkably low. One mission over the Moselle River became emblematic of the aircraft's toughness. During a strafing run, a P-47 was hit squarely by 20-millimeter flak, knocking out one cylinder and rupturing the oil cooler. The pilot, instead of bailing out, climbed to 8,000 feet and nursed the crippled machine 70 miles back to base. When engineers inspected the aircraft, they found fragments of the shell embedded in the armor plate behind the seat. The pilot later remarked, "I owe my life to that bathtub of steel." German pilots still tried to engage where possible. The few remaining Jagdgeschwader units flying F4W-190s and Me-109s ambushed Thunderbolts over the Rhine crossings in the Ruhr Valley. But the disparity in performance and pilot experience was now insurmountable. P-47s could dive away at over 500 miles per hour and recover safely, while German aircraft risked structural failure at those speeds. When the Luftwaffe attempted to counter with jet fighters like the Me-262, the Thunderbolt's role shifted again, not to chase the jets, but to destroy their bases and fuel supplies. Ground observers on both sides began referring to the Thunderbolt as a flying artillery battery. Its resilience allowed it to stay over targets longer than any other single-engine aircraft. Pilots loitered over battlefields, waiting for radio calls from advancing Allied units. When German tanks or strong points appeared, the P-47 swooped down in coordinated attacks, often obliterating the target in seconds. What made these operations so effective was not just firepower, but reliability. The Thunderbolt's radial engine performed in freezing temperatures, through dust, rain, and combat damage. While liquid-cooled fighters required delicate maintenance and risked overheating or coolant leaks, the P-47's engine was nearly foolproof. This mechanical dependability allowed Allied squadrons to fly hundreds of sorties per day with minimal downtime, an advantage the Luftwaffe could no longer dream of. Captured German officers later admitted that the Thunderbolt's endurance demoralized both air and ground forces. One intelligence summary recorded a prisoner's statement, "We know when we hear that sound, someone is going to die. It cannot be stopped." That sentiment captured the Thunderbolt's transformation, from an overweight fighter mocked in 1943 to an indestructible symbol of Allied supremacy 2 years later. By the time Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the P-47 had become as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. Its very presence in the sky signaled to German troops that resistance was futile. The once arrogant confidence of Luftwaffe aces had evaporated. Against the Jug's armor and relentless firepower, skill alone was no longer enough. By March and April 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt was operating in a sky almost entirely owned by the Allies. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been reduced to fragments. Isolated airfields, scattered squadrons, and inexperienced pilots with only a handful of flight hours. The Thunderbolt's dominance was not only a product of numbers, but of engineering that prioritized survival over everything else. It could take punishment, deliver destruction, and still come home. In those final weeks, that design philosophy turned into a tactical revolution. The Thunderbolt became a flying artillery platform in the truest sense. Over the Ruhr and the Rhine, entire fighter groups coordinated with ground commanders via radio. When Allied troops encountered armored resistance or entrenched positions, they called for the Jugs. Within minutes, formations of Thunderbolts appeared overhead, each carrying rockets, bombs, and ammunition belts that weighed more than some early war fighters. They attacked bridges, columns, and rail yards in near-continuous waves. German reports from these operations read like accounts of a natural disaster. "The P-47s come and go at will," one infantry officer wrote. "We shoot, but they do not fall. They destroy everything. Even high-caliber flak often failed to stop them." Anti-aircraft gunners complained that the Thunderbolts could absorb multiple 20-millimeter hits and still dive again, their engines roaring as if nothing had happened. When one was finally brought down, its wreck often lay intact, the pilot having bailed out safely. Proof that the aircraft was not just armored, but overbuilt in every sense. The Thunderbolt's survivability was a triumph of both technology and industrial scale. Republic Aviation had built the P-47 to be repaired quickly. Large panels, modular components, and a rugged frame that could handle rough field landings. Damage that would have written off other aircraft could be patched overnight. Frontline maintenance crews routinely rebuilt wings, replaced engines, and returned aircraft to combat in a matter of hours. This logistical efficiency meant that even after heavy fighting, squadrons remained near full strength. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's newest weapons, the Me-262 jet fighter and the Me-163 rocket interceptor, arrived too late and in too few numbers. When they did appear, the Thunderbolts adapted once again. They learned to attack jets during takeoff and landing, strafing runways and fuel trucks. One famous action saw P-47s destroy a squadron of Me-262s on the ground at Akmer Airfield, eliminating them before they could even leave the runway. The Thunderbolt's toughness allowed it to press attacks through flak and small arms fire, often flying home with fuel tanks riddled and armor scorched. By now, the aircraft's reputation among Allied pilots bordered on reverence. They knew the P-47 could take a beating. Many described it as a guardian angel, a machine that would protect them no matter what. In post-war interviews, pilots credited the aircraft's construction for their survival. "You could feel the metal working for you," one said. "You didn't fly a jug, you rode inside it like armor." The German perspective was the inverse. The Luftwaffe's remaining aces, who once viewed the Thunderbolt with disdain, now respected it as the ultimate enemy, slow to die, fast to strike, and impossible to shake once engaged. "You could not outdive it," recalled one Bf-109 pilot. "You could only pray it chose another target." As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany, the Thunderbolt's impact extended beyond the battlefield. Its presence symbolized the technological and industrial might that had crushed Nazi Germany's war machine. It was the physical embodiment of the Allied approach to war. Not perfection, but endurance. Not elegance, but overwhelming resilience. Every dented fuselage, every scarred wing, every pilot who climbed out of a battered cockpit testified to the same truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not just a fighter. It was survival made mechanical. The armor of a nation that had learned how to win by refusing to break. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt stood as one of the most successful and respected aircraft of the entire conflict. From the fields of Normandy to the skies over Berlin, it had proven itself not just as a fighter, but as a weapon of endurance, an engineering triumph that embodied the industrial and strategic philosophy of the Allied war effort. In total, more than 15,000 Thunderbolts were built, making it the most produced American fighter of World War II. It served in every major theater, from Europe to the Pacific, and in every role imaginable: air superiority, ground attack, bomber escort, reconnaissance. It was not the fastest aircraft of the war, nor the most graceful, but it was the one that came home. That fact alone cemented its reputation among those who flew it. After the war, analysts from both sides examined the reasons for the Thunderbolt's extraordinary combat record. They found that it owed its success to a rare combination of engineering foresight and brute mechanical resilience. The R2800 double WASP engine, a masterpiece of American manufacturing, remained operational even after severe battle damage. The redundant hydraulic and electrical systems ensured that even partial control was enough to get the aircraft home. The thick armor around the cockpit, the self-sealing fuel tanks, and the massive frame all worked together to create something that defied the logic of air combat at the time. German engineers who studied captured Thunderbolts were astonished. In their post-war reports, they admitted that the aircraft was beyond comparison in its ability to sustain damage and remain airworthy. The Luftwaffe's own attempts to create heavily armored fighters, such as the FW-190 Sturmbach, had always come at the cost of performance. But the Thunderbolt had achieved what seemed impossible: protection without fragility, power without compromise. Its influence extended well beyond 1945. Many of the design principles that define the Thunderbolt, redundant systems, armor protection, and structural integrity, became foundational in post-war aircraft development. In Korea, Thunderbolts, now redesignated as F-47s, continued to fly ground attack missions, again demonstrating the same ruggedness that had made them legendary in Europe. For the men who flew it, however, the P-47 was more than a machine. It was a lifeline. Pilots returned from missions with stories of survival that bordered on the miraculous. Engines running on half their cylinders, wings shredded by cannon fire, controls severed, yet still returning home. To them, the aircraft represented something deeper than firepower or armor. It represented the confidence that they would live to see another day. German pilots, once dismissive of the flying tank, came to regard it with grudging respect. Some even admitted admiration for its construction and the bravery of the men who flew it. As one former FW-190 ace recalled years later, "We laughed when we first saw it, but by 1944, no one was laughing. It could take all we had and still come back. We feared it because it did not die." In retrospect, the Thunderbolt story was a lesson in the evolution of warfare. The Luftwaffe's fighters had been built for quick victories, for a war of skill and precision. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, was built for endurance, for a war of attrition that Germany could never win. It symbolized a shift from the individual to the industrial, from finesse to strength, from the duelist sword to the hammer of mass production. When the guns finally fell silent, the P-47 remained, battered, scarred, but unbroken. Across Europe, its hulks littered captured airfields, many still bearing the marks of the countless missions they had survived. They were monuments to a kind of engineering that understood a fundamental truth of total war. Victory does not belong to the most elegant design, but to the one that refuses to fall. The German pilots who once mocked the Thunderbolt's bulk had been right about one thing. It was no ordinary fighter. It was a flying tank. And when the smoke cleared over a defeated Europe, it was the machine that had laughed last. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.